we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Misconceptions. I have a very special guest. Somebody actually, I interviewed you many years ago on behalf of Yesh Tikva, and I'm very thrilled and thankful that I would like to welcome Andrea Braverman, Dr. Andrea Braverman. Thank you for saying yes to our conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me back. I didn't
Uh,
mess up too much for
no,
you.
not only did you not mess up, but like one conversation led to multiple other conversations, even with, multi-generational conversations. It was a learning experience for me, and we'll talk probably a little bit about that conversation as well. But if you'd like, I would like you to start with telling people who you are, and what your expertise is.
Sure. I'm a clinical health psychologist. I work at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital in their outpatient OBGYN department. And I've worked in the infertility field since graduate school. I got into the field in graduate school, did my dissertation on public attitudes about donor insemination, because the study I wanted to do, looking at levels of anxiety and depression over cycles, I couldn't get anybody to participate in because they were so anxious about being discovered or that
Oh,
somebody would
wow.
know that they used donor sperm. So I turned the question around and said, what's contributing to all this anxiety?
Mm.
So once I started looking at that, I was hooked and never looked back. And these days I've always done women's health and working as the sole psychologist in the OBGYN department, do all aspects of women's health, but I still keep near and dear is the infertility that I've done for now, I can say over 40 years.
Ooh, it's amazing when you find your passion and you stick with it. And Dr. Braverman is here in Philadelphia, for so those of you who might not be familiar with the terms of Jefferson. But I think what's so powerful, can I just ask you one question about the term a health psychologist? Can you help people understand why that's different than just a quote unquote regular PhD, PsyD? What is a health psychologist?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I went to graduate school, it was just beginning as a subspecialty. So I didn't realize as a health psychologist until I was doing it for a couple of decades. But
Sure.
these days you can train in it, it is specific, but the training is really when we talk about being a health psychologist, it's saying you're working within the health field, you're working with people usually who have health conditions. It's for example, not only with infertility, but I also do diabetes. Somebody working in that field would call themselves a health
Sure.
psychologist because that's the focus.
hmm Which really identifies that, like, fertility, by definition, is a medical condition, right?
Correct.
And it's something that often is seen. I guess there is so much shame and so much social structuring around social constructs around the even talking about infertility. I'm glad that we're going to have this conversation, but I'm glad, if you think about it, then being a health psychologist frames this as like, this is medical. Like, we are talking about a medical reality that are we at 1 in 6 couples at this point are potentially facing in the United States. Um, let's start with a little bit of what are some of the current trends that we are hearing? Like well, before I do that, I just want to acknowledge that you founded the only mental health conference for therapists who work in infertility. It was its fifth or sixth year. How many years did you just complete? I can't remember.
That was our 13th.
13th year. Sorry, I made a mistake. Okay, I've
Right.
attended for probably 5 or 6 of those years. Um, so the 13th year, and next year it's going to be in Arizona, in Scottsdale. I'm very excited. It's right. It doesn't conflict with Passover. It doesn't conflict with Pesach. So I'm happy about that.
I tried
Um,
really hard.
I'm sure. And this year, this 14th year will be just this ongoing conversation. It's an amazing conference because you're sitting in the room and it's very high level. It's all the new things that are happening, both legally and medically, and really deep diving a little bit more into the social experience and the psychological experience of people who are struggling with infertility. And I always walk away so energized. So thank you for continuing to produce that. Um, when you reflect on these conferences, this last year in particular, maybe, or just in what are the trends? What's happening now? What are the trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, no, it's been interesting because both being in the field for that long and then the now having put together our 14th, we have almost every single faculty member confirmed for the Jones Infertility Counseling Conference. Um, It's really our focus when we first started doing it was honestly what legitimized us in the field. It wasn't the emotional social experience of infertility. It was we were operating in a medical world and it was all about third party issues. So anybody who was using somebody outside themselves, a donor, egg, sperm, embryo, or what was called gestational carrier. There were so many other terms, but we now call surrogacy for the most part. If you go online, it's surrogacy, it's not gestational carrier.
Hmm.
That's somebody caring for somebody else because they can't, either because of health reasons, they don't have a uterus, or you're a same-sex male couple. A lot of different reasons. So the focus was initially that, but that was also because I was doing it with my colleague Susan Crocken, who's a reproductive attorney and really was one of the founders of that field, that aspect of the field, the legal part. And so we both shared a joint interest of saying it's hard if you're working in that space within infertility to not understand the legal implications too.
Hmm. Hmm.
Over the years, it's really evolved and widened. And I would say in the past 6 years or so, focusing on because we were wanting to meet mental health professionals where they what they needed and wanted, as well as quite frankly, as conference directors, what we felt they needed to know too.
Sure.
Sometimes you got to eat your veggies, not just the not just dessert. But it's expanded, I think, more to incorporating different aspects of our field about counseling techniques. People are so hungry for saying, okay, so what's a CBT approach to in pregnancy loss versus let's talk about the more of the research, and I think adding research and how to together has
Hmm.
really become a marriage within our field, partly because we're a big field now. When I got into this, I could probably name everybody in the country that was doing it.
Right.
Now I can't name everybody within my home state of Pennsylvania.
Right, right, right. When you talk about like third party reproduction, this is one area that, especially when working within the religious Jewish community, there's definitely a lot of conflict around it, and there's a lot of conversation that is actually not happening. Meaning, it either there's an assumption that, oh, we don't do those things, which is not accurate and is absolutely not true. And I say that from firsthand proxy, meaning working closely with people who have used donor conception, all forms, donor egg, donor sperm. Actually, I've not yet worked with anybody donor embryo, but definitely surrogacy. And so working with people with all these different makeups, there's a lot of conflict about like, what does this mean for me? And what does this mean for my family? And like, I'm wondering from your perspective, like where were things 10, 20 years ago? Where are things today? How do you see a shift over time?
I think there's been just within the community, not only the national, but the global community, sort of a roller coaster ride of acceptance of all of this. I'd say surrogacy, there's been a downward tick with of feeling that it is exploitative of women. I have very strong
Mm,
feelings that if done right, it's not. However, there are a lot of concerns as it's grown as an industry. But I think donor egg, donor sperm, donor embryo have all been accepted more and more as people build their families in lots of ways. The same way we've seen it that mirrored even with divorce and remarriage, blended families, that families can be more diverse. It's not the 1950s with father knows best.
right.
So, and now, right now, in this moment that where we're talking today in August, I mean, we have Alexandria AOC. Sorry, I'm not going to do her whole name.
Hmm.
AOC announcing how she's frozen her eggs, and all of the different backlash. But even in the past 20 years or so, women in terms of working and career also have said, this is important to me to understand if I'm delaying childbearing, which we see across the country, this has implications for our fertility.
Hmm.
So Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just curious as you bring up the concept of like fertility preservation. We'll come back to the donor concept and discussion. But when it comes to fertility preservation, there's a part of me that wonders if we've kind of like sold women a bill of goods of like you can have it all. You can work till you're 35 and then you can have your kids and don't worry, you'll freeze your eggs and then it'll be fine. You'll be fine. Do you feel that tension as well?
Well, I think it's naive. I mean, insert 3 hour rant about women in healthcare and how their needs get overlooked. I think it's also a little bit biased by the fact you've got OBGYNs who are almost all women now who are delaying childbearing until their 30s, if not late 30s, and some have success and some that don't. The ones that don't are preaching the gospel of age matters, and the ones that did are like, it's overblown. So
Yeah.
there's a little bit of personal experience bias that I think that comes into this to the providers that interface with women.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're changing that trend. But yeah, I think it's a bit of a bill of goods. Yeah, it's not fair.
Right.
Women, we have impact of age, but I think we're also beginning to tell men, guess what, guys, don't worship at the altar of look at the all of the old dudes who got their young wives pregnant, but we're seeing also impact on health of children born from older dads too.
Right. And I love that statistic, by the way. That's when that study came out over the last couple of years, I was like, oh, finally, we could talk about the impact of old sperm. And it
Thanks.
really it is like we have to talk about that as well. For those that maybe are not familiar, there's some evidence of concern that older male sperm may be contributing, I believe it was to autism, the concern that some of their offspring might actually be impacted by old sperm. Listen, if they can call us geriatric pregnancy, I can call them old sperm. It's fine.
I think that's fair.
Think so, right? Very fair. Okay. Coming back to donor, one of the things I've always felt about the donor world of donor conceived children using donor conception, there's this feeling that I have that like science accelerated very quickly to allow us to do these things. In many ways, I would call them miraculously so. And I feel like psychology is kind of like, wait, hold on, we're coming. Like, we're not there yet. Like, do you feel that way as well? And how has that maybe changed over the last 5 to 10 years? Or are we still not there yet of understanding the psychological implications on every level, donor, recipient, offspring, whatever it is, the process? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd modify the answer is yes, and. And the and is, I think those of us who are in the mental health field that have been involved with the American Society of Reproductive Medicine have been jumping up and down for a long time, saying,
Mhm.
hey, not hang on, but here's what we are seeing. And unfortunately, in a medical field where historically that was much more, that's not our problem.
Right.
We're here to fix the body. And how do we get somebody pregnant? And not thinking that the implications of all of this were relevant too. I think that has caught up more. I
Mhm.
do worry a little bit with the introduction of venture capital money into this becoming business that we're sliding backwards to say this is about success rates and not really looking at implications in the way it was done before. And there are a lot of stories where we can talk about that. But excuse me, the I think that I think we have been much more aware because, in all fairness, we sit for anywhere from 45 to 60 minutes, depending on what your model of setting up your appointments may be. And we're hearing things in a deeper level. And it's safer to talk to us because this is where you come to figure all of that out in counseling if we're doing our jobs right. And so we are hearing implications. I mean, certainly when I got into the field, I didn't think about the donor conceived offspring.
Right.
I was working in a medical group. I was working in an IVF center, and it was just like, we can do this. Isn't that great? We can make a family.
Mhm.
And it was also predicated upon the assumption that kids were never going to be told. Because
Right.
back then, all sperm donation was anonymous. We were barely doing egg donation in the 80s. It was reports in the literature of, hey, look what we did. but not being done in the numbers that it was as it grew into the 90s, the aughts, and now into the teens and then the 20s. It's phenomenal the amount of growth. And then you think about it year over year of these kids being born and growing up, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, feel like I was swimming in the ocean and didn't account for the undertow, It's like
Hmm.
I'm way
Hmm.
down the beach now.
Hmm.
And then also the kids grew up and models began to change, and people like same-sex couples and single parents by choice, mostly single moms by choice, began to say, hello, I'm telling my kid. And then that had implications of saying, well, the kid now wants to know. Your assumption that the kids would never know and want to know anything about the donor fell down. And then, as you know as well as I do, along came DNA testing at home, so I could do an ancestry kit, and all of a sudden there was connection that and revelation that was unheard of.
Yeah.
All of a
Yeah.
sudden, people were finding out at all sorts of ages
Right.
that they were donor conceived, and the parents up heretofore were the ones that were making the decisions. Will my kid know or not? It was out of their hands once the kid reached age 18.
Mhm. Did you ever counsel any of those parents, like a returning to therapy, meaning like they had created a family, it was under the cover of anonymity, which we don't even use that word anymore, but it was under the cover of they'll never know. And then 20 years go by and all of a sudden this information is becoming public. Have you ever actually counseled any of those parents?
Oh
You
yeah.
have.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. And we talked, and I said, part of it was my apology tour of,
Mm,
we talked about implications, but not the idea that there was an inevitability. It didn't exist. There was
right.
nothing to counsel on. We hadn't even mapped the human genome when I started this. So, they were coming back to me and saying, my kid's in college. A lot of them were hitting college age. And I was
Okay.
getting this, I'm hearing about this, I'm reading about this. And I was like, okay, here we are in whatever it was in the teens and the 20s saying, for their kids and also the year, and saying, this is the way the world looks now. What do you want to do about it? And
Hmm.
then that gets into the counseling around both anger and grief and sadness. I don't control this, but I do control this. Like, I can't control that they might never find out, but I can control what the narrative I'm going to tell my child at
Hmm.
this point.
I feel like it's such a devastating secret to hold when it became a devastating secret. Meaning if it was done and it was passed, then they'll never know is very different than, but at any time they can now find out. Right? Like when it became a reality, it shifts the way that that secret feels in the body, I imagine.
I would imagine too, although again, I think that for a lot of people, the heaviness is that secret grew.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't think people ever, at least in my experience, I would imagine if it was before. I still remember I had a couple reach out to me. They were in their 70s. I must have been about 40. So, if you do the math, I mean, they conceived their kids way back. They had two daughters that they conceived through donor sperm back at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia, which has nothing to do with the clinical stuff now. And so that sort of dated them just to begin with. And so they conceived them. They knew almost next to nothing about their donors, but they'd seen me interviewed, I think it was in USA Today or something, in an article talking about this trend toward disclosure. And I remember we were talking, and this was before DNA testing was available and all of this explosion of you can find people through that. So at that period of time, they were saying, should we tell our daughters? And I said, well, what do you have to tell them? There was no way to find out anything about the donor. So their burden of, if the right thing is to tell them for their medical history and all that, but we have zero, that'd be very different than if they came to me today and I'd be like, absolutely, they can find the donor. They can find a donor adjacent at least
Hmm. Hmm.
person
Hmm.
in their genetic makeup. So it's just fascinating how much has changed. And even, I look back and I say, oh, I regret. that conversation with them. But at that time, we still didn't have, if you told me there was going to be an ancestry program and they ran sales around the holidays, I'd
Right.
be like, you're out of your mind.
Right, right. Which
And
also, by the way, all that data kind of floating, the 23andMe data is just kind of floating out there as the company went debunked and nobody know defunct, like it's nobody knows what, like
where the heck
where
is it?
where's all this information going to sit eventually? Yeah.
But going back to the original thing that I usually start and then wander off from is that I think that that sense of keeping a secret was always there, that somehow
Mm,
that
mm,
they would, that this would come out in some way. And
hmm.
here was that couple who was in their 70s with full-grown daughters with children of their own. And here it was for them. See, it finally. So otherwise, why would they be coming into my office? Which
Right.
quite frankly was a privilege for me to talk to them. I'm not sure I helped them all that
Hmm.
much, but I was a safe place to talk it out. Um, and it was just profound of saying, yeah, this has been with you and dogging your heels all these years.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we know this about secrecy in general. Like it just can make you sick. As we say, secrets make you sick, but it doesn't feel like there's always an alternative. Like it doesn't always feel like there's a way for there to be a disclosure that feels safe or comfortable. I actually want to come back to that in terms of the religious world, because I want to ask you some more pointed questions about that, because in many ways, there are those communities within the religious world that really would not likely have access to the internet or to these platforms of of informational disclosure. And so I think there's this false sense of like protectedness of like, well, I really don't have to tell because my kid's never going to have a smartphone, right? We all know why that's a false statement, but an important one to acknowledge where we're going to come. I want to come back to culture.
Yeah.
I'd love to ask you about your own story. The conversation that you and I had many years ago, I think you are so fascinating, but tell us a little bit about what it is that you decided to do when you were a young married woman. Tell us a little bit about your trajectory.
Yeah. No, my husband and I got into it because we knew we were going to have fertility challenges based on medical history and all of that. So, that got me into the field, and I am not your typical person who said, do you want to be an egg donor? But I always thought about it as all this. I also realized I did not want to be an anonymous egg donor very early on, and I was still in the age then where we thought I could be an egg donor between ages. I was in my early 30s, and we were actually accepting people up until 35 at that point.
Mm,
But my best friend and her husband had been going through fertility uh, treatment and failure after failure, cycle after cycle. It didn't work. They were just at the point where they were trying to adopt, and that wasn't going easily either. And my husband and I had sat down and had a conversation and said, "Do we want to help them out? Like we could do this." And if you know my best friend, she's the opposite of me. We are, if you're old enough to know the cartoon character Mutt and Jeff, I am tall. She is not. We look nothing alike, but we shared in so many things in our lives that, we matched on that.
mm,
And our husbands were friends and all of that. And we came to the conclusion we wanted to offer to be a donor to them, not knowing whether they'd accept or not. And I say we because I never would have done it without him. I feel very strongly that partners need to be involved in this. And so we offered, and long story short, they were trying to adopt. They were matched, but as I said, it wasn't going well. And we offered, as my friend said, they ended up with boy-girl twins who are turning 33 in a few months. And she said, her husband said, well, we'll just continue with both. And she said, what if we have twins? And the irony is actually on the first scan, they had three, which was
Oh
everybody was
goodness.
like, oh no, back in those days, we weren't so good at it. And we threw a bunch in there.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, they ended up letting go of the adoption when they realized they were twins for sure. One of them was a vanishing embryo, and they ended up with their twins. But she still looks at him and said, "Can you imagine if we went ahead with the adoption too?" So, but it was, out of all the things in my life, the I do say it's one of the things I feel most proud of, that I
Mm,
was able to give that gift, that my husband was also able to give that gift. And again, we're not typical. We had been talking about it, and even though our kids were young, it was I would bring them with me if I was going to a conference and travel and all of that. So this was not something that would was new to
right.
anybody.
Right. You had children already at that point, correct? You had your own
Yes,
children.
we had our
And
own.
I would like to ask you some questions that I imagine the audience might ask you in understanding the mindset. Um, how do you experience the twins that are now 33? How do you think about them? Or, yeah, I'm sure you think about them as, lovely, nice people, but how do you perceive them either as a relative of yours? Is it a beloved niece and nephew? How do you experience them in your life?
There are there are elements of all of that, but ultimately they're not in my life very much. I am still best friends with their mom and dad, but they're off, they're living their lives. They're building their lives and doing all of that. I had brought them in along with my daughters to a conference and had them as part of a panel. And it was like the first time we all sort of were being more public about it.
Hmm.
Um, I think of them in terms of a little bit like we don't have the word for it. They're very special to me.
Hmm.
They're most special to me because of their parents.
Mm.
And that's like, we all have friends where their kids are kind of, our kids too, that
Sure. Right.
in a sense, but not the way they're not at holidays. We don't have our families don't interact that way. I've known everything about them growing up, but I would have whether I was their donor or not.
Right.
So I wasn't afforded a special role that way. Once they knew and they found out when they were told. They didn't find out, they were told. At age 15, then there became that shifted the relationship, and they were teenagers. They wanted nothing to do with me. It's like awkward. What are you doing? Um, and we were sitting shiva for my mom, and that was the first time I saw them after their parents told them. So it was not like, hey, let's sit down and talk about this. I was sitting shiva and they came, and they would have come again no matter what, whether they
Sure.
were told or
Sure.
not, because of, but it's like it was just it unfolded. And I can't tell you the same way it's still unfolding today, and about seeing where they are in their lives. I had the pleasure of seeing, we were the godparents to them, which I was
Hmm.
like, wait a minute, I already gave you the eggs. I have to keep giving presents? Like, what's this? I'm getting the short end of the stick. But my friend who was an events planner said, I'll give you two bat mitzvahs and two weddings. So I think that in the end, I got the better end of the deal, but she disagrees. Um, but it was like just depending on it's almost like stopgap photography. You only get these glimpses in our lives because we live far enough away that from
Hmm.
each other that it wasn't like let's just drop in for dinner or anything like that. We always have had to plan to see each other. And
Hmm.
yes, phone works, but when your mom's talking to her friend on the phone, you're ignoring that.
Sure.
So I think that's a lot of, at least from in my lived experience doing a known situation, there's no template you put down because things like geographical distance, age and stage of the children's lives. But when they got up on stage together, and my friends' kids, were like, we don't think we're that interesting. Why do people want to hear our story? And I'm like, trust me, they do.
I remember the panel. Hmm.
And my daughters, who were not your typical kids of a mom who donated, they've been going to these conferences. They knew it. In fact, I'm very proud of the fact my younger daughter just became chief of staff for Resolve, which is the
Oh,
National
no kidding. Good for her.
Infertility Family
Oh.
Building Association. So it's like, like in part of that was because her second kid was through IVF. So like, it's just like worlds collide, and
Hmm.
they bring you on these journeys, whether it's important or not. I mean, the nice thing was I'd like to think my husband and I were a pretty normal, healthy created a healthy family to grow up in, and so did my friend and her husband. So these kids weren't lacking for like anything. And it was,
Mhm.
once it was open, it was open. Ask away. And again, the kids were like, "Ah," and then our kids Facebook friended each other, to which I don't do any social media type thing. And I was like, wait, they did what? And they're like, yeah, no, we see what they're doing. We see what's going on in each other's lives. That's fine. Like,
Mhm.
that was such a fascinating way for them to get to know each other.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And God knows what they do these days.
So they didn't do not perceive them as siblings. They don't say like these are my sister and brother.
No,
Or
they
do
would not use that term. And particularly because my friend's kids have a genetic half sister who was from his first marriage, but that's their
mm,
sister. They would never
hmm
say half sister. That's my sister.
hmm
And what they landed on, because remember, they didn't find out till 15, and my kids were older than that, was they jokingly referred to each other as the secret half siblings.
Oh, interesting. Uh-huh. Secret
So
half
that they
siblings.
made up their own term.
Hmm
Nowadays, because it's what, 18 years later,
hmm
that I think they would just say, yeah, I have genetic half siblings out there, but that's not this. I have genetic half brother, I have a genetic half sis, but they would not, as many in the donor conceived community would say siblings.
hmm hmm
But again, I think that's because their experience was completely different, as opposed to, I have a genetic half sibling that I found out about and I'm
Right,
related to
right.
through this donor who, although I have a profile on them, is still unknown. For
Yeah.
better or for worse, I was there.
Right, 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 right. There was no surprises about that. Meaning, yes, it was surprising to find out the information, but you were able to they were given information. Like there was nothing they couldn't find out about that
Exactly.
story. What are we hearing about from people who are finding out unexpected information? Um, let's say where they are informed, they're told by their parents, but they're older, they're 17, 18, 19, 20. What do
Right.
we know? What do these individuals experience emotionally? And again, that's a broad stroke. I know that.
Yeah.
But what are you hearing?
Well, it depends under the circumstances. I can't help but say that. I mean, if it's
Sure.
done because parents are divorcing and it's ugly and all of that, and it's weaponized information, that's one
Mm,
experience. Hopefully that is the minority. I was actually an expert witness at a court trial between a couple that had divorced and were fighting over when and how to tell the child she was egg donor conceived.
oh my.
So that's one extreme. The I think the other is where parents are genuinely trying to do what they feel is in the best interest of their kids. And that's still complicated because there is all of the years of, but you didn't tell me, and yet you're trying to tell me this is such a great story, and it doesn't line up. That's why we've arrived at, like, let's tell kids from the time they can begin to understand, plant the seeds, so to speak, let them grow, and over time, let them go through their own developmental stages of understanding and emotional response to this information. Um, I think what we're hearing back from later discovery is a lot of it are terming it, are using that term, late discovery kids. A lot of it is the feelings both toward the parents of you kept a secret, and they use that term, and parents are like, no, 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 we were trying to protect you. It was still a secret. For some, if the parent had, depending on the people I've met who's had the parent, one of the parents, and usually particularly the non-genetic the parent has deceased, there's no opportunity for closure with that. I
Mm,
can't talk with, in this case, mostly dad about, it's okay, I love you, or I don't love you, I'm angry with you.
right.
There's no opportunity for that. So it can be really complicated grieving and also disruption in the relationship with the parent as they perceived it. I think when the parents are sitting down, and I've seen some amazing couples who have divorced since the 18 to 20 years since I've seen them, and yet they're working so well as parenting partners on
hmm
this.
hmm
Um, and it goes well for the witness by the fact that if it doesn't go well, I get a call. If I don't,
Right.
I don't always get the follow-up call. It's like
Right.
there's one couple I keep thinking it must have worked out well because I know you well enough now that you would have called me if it
Right.
didn't.
Right.
Um, but again, it's sort of giving that respect back, giving the agency back to the donor conceived person to say, this is about me. It's not about you. And it's stepping out of their way to let them have whatever feelings and reactions they're going to have. If they're curious, supporting that curiosity, still being a parent of
Mhm.
saying, okay, like you want to meet the donor, we can certainly go on that journey, just not feeding into the fantasy of I'll meet this donor and everything in my life will make sense. I mean,
Right.
they're still a person on the other end, and they're not like their profile. They're now 20 years older. I don't know about
True.
you, but certainly if I'd been contacted in my 40s, 50s as a donor, I would have looked a lot different from my 20-year-old profile, literally and
Right.
figuratively.
But you just said something really powerful, the idea of that it is now the story of the donor conceived child. Meaning, until that point, it's the story of the couple, let's call it that, the couple trying to create a child and creating a family. And their story is one of infertility and not having enough eggs or not having healthy sperm. And then they make this decision and they have this baby, and this is their family system. And when they are going to choose a disclosure, let's put it in that way, then the story is shifting and the focus of the story has to shift to the child, no matter how old they are. And it really is about how do I create a supportive space, helping them create a new narrative of their own identity that isn't about my infertility narrative, right? It's really, it can't focus anymore on all the feelings and emotion that came in to play in the experience, because that doesn't matter to this child. None of that matters. It really is about the child. It's fascinating to hear you like kind of like tease that apart a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but think about it. We do that as therapists all the time. The
Sure.
parent that needs the child to take care of them. The
Yeah.
concern is, and that's why it depends. You think that's going to stop just because I have to tell you my fertility story now? And
Right.
that's when it can get pretty wonky and not, it doesn't work so well.
Yeah.
So, you can't disentangle the two. People
No.
keep wanting to do that. Like, well, you tell them and you tell them this way, and it's like, okay, aren't we presuming everybody's healthy and functional in the
Exactly.
system? Like
Right.
that would be
Not so much.
lovely.
Right. For sure. For sure. And I think that maybe that comes back to the question that I think I want to kind of hone in a little bit on is this idea where within the religious world there definitely is a broader feeling of like nobody will ever know. And even if I agree with the ASRM guidelines of we tell them young and we tell them until we are comfortable telling them and until it's not a big deal and they could talk about it on the playground, in a culture where we don't talk about sexuality at all, we don't talk about sex and conception at all until many communities significantly later in that child's development, sometimes only upon preparation for marriage. Many communities are shifting in that way of giving more basic information a little bit earlier, but and it's definitely something of like, you better not talk about it to anybody, right? Like their mother can tell them, I'm telling you, don't talk about it to anybody else. And now we're being told by the guidelines, which is we should tell them and we should tell them young and often. There's such conflict in the guidelines versus the culture. And actually, at conference, I think it was last year, not this most recent one, was the first time I heard a presenter say that you need to take into consideration whether telling the child is going to impact them on a family or communal level. And the specific example of that could be like coming from a Nigerian culture where it's about paternal lineage and you may not know the paternal lineage might be non-Nigerian or whatever, you can really cause like almost like a disruption in the family structure. Like the child may be disowned by the grandparents, as an example, and
Yeah.
obviously many other communities as well. So how do we reckon with this? If you're a therapist listening to this conversation, this is something I'm trying to reckon with as like, these are the guidelines, and I also know the culture, right? And I also know there's a lot of judgment about like, if you knew that a child was donor conceived, in the religious world, there may be a conversation of like, I don't want to make a shidduch with that child, right? I wouldn't make a shidduch with that family. That's a reality, whether
Yeah.
you like it or not. It's a reality, right? I wouldn't want to make a match. So talk to me, how do we reckon with this as therapists? How do we reckon with this as a community? Because again, I want to just restate this as factual. Our religious Jewish community is using surrogacy, it is using donor egg, it is using donor sperm. You may not know it, but it is being done. And there are multiple rabbis who are permitting, and there are multiple rabbis who are not permitting. And depending on what community of culture, which Hasidus, which non-Hasidus, wherever you're coming from, is going to give you different answers to this very, very painful question of what is available to you in order to create your family if your own biology isn't working the way that we would like it to. So I throw the question out there, like, how do
Yeah.
you contend with this?
Yeah. No, it's an amazing question, and you gave an amazing talk for us at the conference years ago, putting this out there too, and making people recognize this. Um, I think honestly, this is not, it comes up in different permutations as we've talked about that, I've worked with couples that come from a country where doing that, it is illegal.
Mhm.
And I had one couple that came from such a country around surrogacy. It was his sister who carried, but she had a daughter, and how they did a fan dance to keep the daughter from having to carry this secret while mom lived in the United States and carried this pregnancy and delivered. And then you also have to that like, are you going to tell your obstetrician that when you say how many pregnancies have you had? I mean, it's so much about implications for health. And I think this is ultimately respecting the culture, and not just the culture. You just did an exquisite job of talking their subcultures even within the cultures, depending
Absolutely.
on where you live. And really getting with them of saying, tell me what you are living in and what the implications are for you
Mhm.
and for your
Mhm.
child. Because the implications may not be till age of marriage,
Mhm.
which could be late teens to through on up, depending
Right,
on where you are living, right?
right, right.
So it's saying and making a decision as we do as parents all the time of what is in the best interest of my child. And all we can do is hope as hard as we can that we're making the best one. I've had people say it is my burden to carry because of these long-term implications. And I'll say,
Mhm.
okay, we've gotten there. Now, let's talk about medicine. Do you go to the doctor? Will your child go to the doctor? The answer is, of course, is yes. You ever go to a doctor outside of your community, out of your culture? Well, yes, it could be. Okay, we've seen this happen in the world in general, but we don't know what medicine is going to do. Medicine is now, people always told me that we wouldn't take a medical history, but you will get a medical history because we're not to the point where we can take a vial of blood and not need a medical history to still inform the decisions that were made. What
Mhm.
happens if your child gets X, Y, or Z and now they are 15?
Mhm. Mhm.
Are you going to let it go so far as that? Like, you can always make the decision to tell. You just can't go from telling to not telling. Duh,
Right.
right? And so it's helping them tease apart all of the layers, making the best informed decision they can have. Not to say you should because ASRM says so. That's based on like a one size fits all cultural approach, right?
Mhm.
It's really going back and teasing the layers and saying, okay, implications if we go this route, implications if we go this route. What do you think is in the best interest of your child? Knowing this,
Right.
I can turn around and say, well, people shouldn't judge. Yeah, that's
Sure.
nice.
Right.
Show me that community anywhere
Exactly.
in the
Right.
world.
Right. Right.
So that's my answer is not to say you have to come out with it saying just because our professional society says you should. I agree. I just gave you a profound, long, rant about why I think it's important to do that. But I also know we all live in the real world.
Right. right,
I also
right.
use the example of a very dear friend and colleague of mine who worked as a nurse in the field for many years. She planned to tell her kids very young, but what got in the way? They had one parent after another getting sick and dying. They had young kids, and they're like, we're not throwing anything else. But when they got to be age 8, they were like, she said to me, I can't wait any longer. Can I borrow the books off your shelf? I said,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, yeah. I think that's what, I hear even when I'm speaking with somebody recently about her own, like, when will I tell my child? And she's in a more modern community where she won't have as much concern for judgment, but also like, when is the right time and when is the right age? And when, there's so many of these questions that I think are so relevant to the level of exposure that the child might have to this information in any other, in any other forum. But I just want to highlight for somebody who might not have understood what you said, the question about medical record, right? You may have a child who gets diagnosed with something that maybe is inherited, and it's not inherited from one of the biological parents and the genetic parent. It's the genetic parent that is, or the genetic donor that is where this issue is coming from. So I have heard that show up where kind of everything blew up because of that. But it's a risk. Maybe it's a minor risk, but it is considered a risk. Yeah,
I would say more of a larger risk to the parents is that when the child is 18 and older and now 40, 48, 58, 68, health comes up. I mean,
sure.
let me tell you, being in my 60s now, you know, you get stuff, right? And you go to the doctor. And what we do today for some things is very different from what we do when we're younger, or even for myself. I mean, I was diagnosed at age 45 as a type 1 diabetic. It's part of
Mm.
the reason I do diabetes work. And all of a sudden I realized, oh, implications for my kids. And then a few days later, I was like, oh crap, I gotta go tell my friend
Right,
so kids know.
right, right,
And that
right.
wasn't evident no, that's not genetic. Thank God it's really raises very little concern, but for them, the risk is higher but low, if
Hmm.
that makes sense.
Hmm.
But they might, let's say they develop it and they're asking now to their parents, like,
Where did this
it's
come from?
more
How did it
common,
show
but
up?
still,
Hmm.
yeah.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, parents are like, oh, wait, what? It's like, do we need to go back to the donor? And like, it wouldn't make a difference.
Right. And also very often I think that at least historically, we really don't have a way to get to those donors, right? Today there may be a little bit more tracking available depending on where you're receiving the donor from, like the donor egg or sperm from. But historically, I think it was given anonymity. It was like we're not going to find that information out for you.
Right. So it
Yeah.
wouldn't matter to my kids. But
Right.
even if you're in a community where there are really heavy implications for telling your child,
Yeah.
it's still, you don't know what's going to happen 40 years from now, and they could find out inadvertently
Correct.
because now medicine is doing the blah, blah, blah
I
DNA
I
analysis.
agree. I think that is, we know that's going to be the future is the typing of our genetics. I want to throw one other thing into the conversation in the last couple minutes that we have that sits on me a little heavily is that when there is non-conversation about this or we're not disclosing this information, what's happening in the religious Jewish world typically, and not exclusively, but very often, there is the desire for a Jewish egg. And for some of you, this may be an unknown concept, but we believe in matrilineal descent, and that is done via biology. And so, a genetic egg, a genetically Jewish egg from a Jewish woman, means that the child will have a certain genetic status if the person who is carrying the child is Jewish as well. There's a lot of conversation. I could spend hours discussing that, not going to. What I want to highlight is my question mark. Maybe it's a minuscule risk, but the concept of consanguinity.
Yeah.
When we're working with a population that's small, and that population wants to only work with Jewish egg banks, of which is even smaller, it means the pool of resources is really small. And
Yeah.
it makes me really question this concept of non-disclosure. If you used a Jewish egg donor from a Jewish egg bank who is non-disclosed, you don't know who it is. Not that that even would be relevant in this question. how are you going to confirm that your child will not come into a relationship with someone who's also genetically conceived by the same from the same donor? And that worries me. It does worry me.
Worries me too. I mean,
Yeah.
you're taking me back to the 80s when people were not disclosing to they weren't going to disclose to their children. We were using egg donors that we just started doing. Actually, it was really more the early 90s that we started recruiting egg donors in the Philadelphia area where I was working. And people were, that was a major issue, and it had nothing to do with religious and or cultural background.
Mhm.
It was just, and it there's a case actually. Susan Crocken talks about it, the attorney, about a woman who donated her embryos, and she said, "I just ask that you donate in away from my small community." Story winds up that it goes to somebody who lived down the street from her.
Yeah. And the kids became friends and the kids played, I think it was like hockey together and there was
Football.
even a
Yep.
football together and there was even a question of a relationship between the two siblings. And it's really terrifying, that part of it. And I want to put that out there because I think that it is a bit of the Wild West. And if we're taking the Wild West into the religious Jewish world, we've got to just be knowledgeable of like, oh, that'll never happen to me versus like, yeah, but it can. And I think we
Right.
need to consider that when we talk about disclosure as well. So,
Absolutely. It's hard,
yeah,
but that's making informed decisions, not saying that
exactly.
la la la, it won't. It's like,
Exactly.
what if?
Exactly. All right, 2 minutes left. Tell me
Yep.
one misconception that you wish people would know and understand about the fertility world,
Oh, well, you
or
start.
about or eggs or donors or whatever. One misconception.
I think it's what you opened up with. It's a medical condition. This isn't, the Freud was wrong. This isn't about fear. Now, people drop out of treatment and all of that because of stress and fear and all of that. But so, yeah, if your tubes are blocked and you're dropping out of treatment, I guess you can make that claim. But the just relax and you'll get pregnant still makes me bang my head against the wall.
Always. Thank you so much for this conversation. I so appreciate you.
You are welcome. We appreciate you too.